Shalom and welcome to the One Pasuk podcast, in which three rabbis from Englewood, New Jersey, each share an insight on one particular pasuk from the Parsha and reflect on each other's ideas. Rabbinic banter, I like to call it. I am Rabbi Chaim Pupko of Congregation Ava Torah, and I'm joined by my dear friends and colleagues,
Rabbi Akiva Block, Gilat Kesher,
and Rabbi Daniel Goldberg, Eitz Chaim, the Englewood Steeple.
To sponsor an episode of the One Pasuk podcast, visit onepasukpodcast.com and click on the sponsorship link. And please take a moment and give us a 5-star rating on your podcast platform.
The pasuk that I chose for Parshas Emor comes from the very end of the Parsha, and it's this fascinating, self-contained story. The pasuk starts as follows, starts the whole episode. It says, Vayetze ben Isha Yisraelis, Suhu ben Ish Mitzri, Besoch b'nei Yisrael, Vayinatzu b'machaneh ben ha-Yisraelis, v'ish ha-Yisraeli. Now, the son of an Israelite woman, and he was the son of an Egyptian man, went out among the children of Israel, and they fought, they quarreled in the camp, this son of the Israelite woman and an Israelite man. So there's some sort of fight that breaks out between this person who was from a Jewish mother and an Egyptian father. He fights with someone else, a Jewish individual and a Jewish man. And in the context of that fight, as the episode continues, he curses the name of Hashem, he blasphemes the name of Hashem, and the Jewish people put him in prison. What should we do with him? And ultimately, he's stoned and he's killed. And I chose this pasuk, firstly, because I happen to really like little cruxes in the Torah that are these self-contained nuggets that you can put both hands around and really dig your teeth into. And this is one of those little nuggets. I also think that it's a mystifying story. More than it tells, it doesn't tell. It withholds. It almost, to me, like evokes when Cain kills Hevel, where like the essence of the story isn't really there. It's just like the aftermath that we know a lot about. And because of that, there's this huge spectrum of explanations for what accounted for, what catalyzed this fight, what was motivating this individual. And so I think it's provocative. It can take us in a lot of different directions. And with that, which direction do you want to take us in, rabbis?
So, Rabbi Goldberg, despite your best efforts to self-contain this episode, my dear friend and colleague, nothing in the Torah is ever really fully self-contained. I just want to note, first of all, beautifully dovetailing from our discussion last week about lo sekal al cheresh. So nice. there is that, of course, that connection. But this is one of two narrative passages in all of the book of Vayikra. The first, of course, is the death of Aaron's two sons. And the second one is this. Both, ironically, maybe not coincidentally, have to do with children. And it's really quite fascinating. Rav Hirsch writes beautifully about how this episode is really the beginning of the end of the book of Vayikra, which is really a series of social, societal laws. You have this, and you have the halachos of nezek, of damages. You have Shemitah and Yovel, which are really societal constructs, and a bunch of other things that take place at the end of Vayikra. But it's fascinating to note that the Torah, in the book known as Torah's Kohanim, the halachos of the Kohanim, the priests, the priestly rite, a series of laws having to deal virtually entirely with our relationship with Kedusha and Tahara, sanctity and purity, access to the Mishkan, to the sanctuary, the consumption of karbanos, of ritual sacrifices, really our relationship with and interaction with holiness. Now, the Torah tells two stories about relationships between parents and children. In this particular instance, you have a person who grew up in a home of, let's just say, complexity. One parent who is Jewish, the other parent who is non-Jewish. It's not entirely clear whether even people who were born before the Torah was given, whether matrilineal descent, which is our standard for Jewishness now, whether that even applied to people who were born before Matan Torah, so this person's Jewishness was even called into question, perhaps. And because of the mixed messages and the complexity and the challenge under which this person was raised, they clearly, maybe not entirely because of, but certainly not divorced from the home in which they grew up, they end up growing up to be a quarrelsome person and a person who ultimately ends up blaspheming, being Mekhalel Hashem. And I think the message is clear that in the sea of laws having to do with ritual and mikdash and tahara and kedusha and so much of what we would consider to be normative Judaism, Shabbos and Yontif and Shul and Taharas HaMishpacha and keeping kosher, all the things which appear in the book of Vayikra, the Torah, as it transitions away from that ritual and into the latter half of the book of Vayikra, which is really all about society, the beginnings of that discussion and the form that that transition takes is to be anchored in home life. And nothing's a guarantee ever, but the Torah is teaching us something really important. You can be the biggest Shomer Shabbos, you could be the biggest Shomer Kashrus, you could be the biggest Shomer Taras HaMishpacha, all the top and holidays, all the topics which are discussed in the book of Vayikra. But if you have a situation akin to Ben Ish Mitzri V'Isha Yisraelis, a home, in this particular case, a home of intermarriage, but if you have a home where a proper behavior is not modeled, where parents don't model for their children the kind of behavior that they would wish for them to bring out into the world, you end up vayinatzu, you end up with a person who just is okay with fighting, and you end up with a person who ultimately ends up blaspheming Hashem. And again, nothing's a guarantee. Even modeling good behavior doesn't automatically result in our children engaging proper behavior, which brings us, of course, to the foil of this story, which is Aaron HaKohen. There was no greater model than Aaron HaKohen, and his children also seem to have gone astray in some way, shape, or form. We can parse and figure out exactly where maybe Aaron as a parent went wrong, but certainly there's no guarantee. But I think the Torah's message is clear that the anchor of religious life really needs to be the home. And those two narrative passages in the sea of ritual is really trying to teach us that in terms of modeling good behavior, in terms of conveying the proper and appropriate messages to our children. And as the Torah transitions from ritual and Kedusha and Tahara into societal and communal, these are the messages that it wants us to know.
So that beautiful idea taught me something, and that is that the lens of Vayikra is so focused on the Mishkan. So much of Vayikra is about what goes on in the center, in the Mishkan, the Kohanim. It's called Torah's Kohanim, as you mentioned. But now you can see very consciously how the Torah shifts its lens away from the Mishkan and towards the home to remind us that it's not all about the Mishkan, and it's not all about that spiritual center. That spiritual center is supposed to create a community, an environment in which that kind of holiness operates throughout. And so I never thought about it in that way, but based on the way you're explaining it, really, you can look at the lens beginning at Vayikra as focused squarely on the Mishkan for so long, and then the scene changes, and now we're looking at the camp. And that's, yeah, it's very beautiful the way you put that.
And I think it's so interesting to juxtapose, as you did, these stories, this story with the story of Nadav and Avihu, because in a sense, they are opposites.
Polar opposites.
Because one could think about the story of Nadav and Avihu was, in a certain sense, a story of over-familiarity and comfort with the heights of spiritual life of the Jewish people. These were the princes of the Jewish people, the son of Aaron HaKohen, the heir apparent to the high priesthood, who, the whole Basi Neman, who, I know that's said of Moshe, but in a sense, they actually can be in every part of the holiest places. And there was a sense of they were too cavalier in offering an Eish Zara. And this is the mirror opposite, which is someone who was really an outsider. And according to one explanation, was simply not given any kind of safe harbor. He said, hey, I want to be here in Shevet Dan. And no, you can't. Right? Rashi says they wouldn't let him because the Shvatim go based on the father. So here was the ultimate outsider, and those are the ultimate insiders. And putting them together, I think, leads us to this really interesting idea that both of these extremes can lead to serious pitfalls and dangers. And so, yeah, it's very provocative.
I love that framing, and I think both of those sentiments can be very much felt from home life. In other words, the way parents speak about or relate to or explain the Jewish enterprise to their children and the way they live it so much influences the way children feel towards that. Aaron was as much an insider as there could possibly be. And it was incumbent upon him to convey to his children that you should take nothing for granted and you should strive for Kedusha, but within a certain framework and within a certain construct. And it is not the case that anything goes so long as you're well-intentioned. That was that message. And the message that the Makalel, this Ben Ish Mitzri and Isha Yisraelis, needed to hear from his Jewish home was, I know you feel like you're an outsider, but you're not. You're as Jewish as me. You're as Jewish as anybody. And that message was not reinforced. I love that. I love that framing very much.
Yeah. Yeah. I was also looking at the fact that this very short narrative in the context of Vayikra, which is almost completely laws, and it's one of two very brief narratives, right? Nadav and Avihu and their tragic death. And I was thinking about the fact that the theme of Vayikra is basically answering the question, how do we live with God? The book of Shmos concludes with the Shekhinah, Hashem's presence, coming down into the Mishkan. So now that Hashem is dwelling among Bnei Yisrael, so that means there are certain expectations, right? We have to build a sacred society, and it emerges from the Mishkan and spreads outward. And so Vayikra begins with how we take care of, operate, engage with the Mishkan, and then it moves on to other spheres of life where we need to maintain sanctity, Kedusha. So in this Parsha, Parshas Emor, you have the sanctity of time with the cycle of the festivals and Shabbos. And so this short, tragic episode, I think, comes to highlight the fact that the relationship between Hashem and Bnei Yisrael is deepening, right? Hashem now lives together with Bnei Yisrael, and now there's more responsibility, and a reflection of that relationship deepening and responsibility increasing is this is the potential for what could go wrong. I think that's how we can understand Nadav and Avihu as well, right? At that stage of Hashem's presence being in the Mishkan, now there's a certain responsibility to take care of that Mishkan in a certain way. And Nadav and Avihu, their tragic deaths are a stark lesson that now that there's this closeness, now that the covenant between Hashem and the Jewish people is strengthened, there's now the potential for greater harm. It's a little bit like our relationships, right? The people we can hurt the most are the people that are closest with us, because just that's the nature of having a close relationship. And so it's not just in the Mishkan, Nadav and Avihu story, but it's throughout the camp. But I think there's an even further lesson. As you guys noted, we're talking about someone who's an outsider. And I think one of the implicit messages here is that as this sacred society is being built, as Hashem's presence is now more manifest among Bnei Yisrael, we have to think about, we have to take care of people who may not feel part of that society or who may feel different and alone within that society. And it's interesting that while the story is focused on what this outsider did wrong, I think the fact that the punishment was meted out by the entire nation, right? Vayirgemu oso kol ha'edah, he was stoned to death by the entire people. I don't think that was meant to say that the people have to eradicate this evil from their midst. I think it's just the opposite. I think it was a very sobering lesson to the people that they were responsible. They were responsible to make this person feel included. And the fact that he went the way that he did is their responsibility. And so that's why they have to participate in this whole episode.
Right.
And so bottom line, we are seeing the final pieces of the sacred society, the sacred community being put together. All the pieces are now in place. And comes this episode, this stark lesson to show the greater responsibility we have and the greater challenges we'll have in maintaining this sacred society, caring for everybody.
That's beautiful. And I think it's depicted, it's captured because in the psukim themselves, because when they determine that they're going to kill him and stone him, it says, V'samchu kol hashomim es yedayim al rosho. And all the people who heard the curse uttered, the blasphemy uttered, they place their hand upon him. They do smicha, like you would on a korban chatas, right?
Or
and so,
I thought you were going to say egla rufa.
right, we have this idea, and it expresses a kind of participation in the guilt of this thing.
Yeah.
So there is that fascinating reflective, like, what does this mean for society, and what was our shortcoming, and how do we need to improve from this?
Yeah.
So interesting. As right, Popko, as you're saying, as society develops, as the society of the Jewish people develops and their relationship with Hashem deepens, we're urged to ask ourselves how we hold so many of these tensions, these pressures and these counter pressures as we build all of our respective communities. Our instinct is to be like radically inclusive and just come and participate, and to a certain extent, come as you are. Anything goes, because we try to be good and inclusive and warm and tolerant and inviting and welcoming. And sometimes the question becomes, at what point are you compromising other values? As a result, maybe if things end up going awry,
Right.
to what extent are we responsible for that? Either because we were too inclusive, we were too exclusive.
I have a great example.
What?
I have a great example of what you're saying. If a woman wants to put on a tallis, okay, it's not my minhag. You don't observe halacha that way, but I grant that person has a sincere desire to serve Hashem in that way. But if that very same person came into our shul where women don't wear a tallis, I would be bothered by the fact that that person would not be respecting our customs, right? And I'd be very conflicted, because on the one hand, I want to welcome this person into our community, and I want to welcome this person into our shul, and I want them to feel comfortable davening in our shul. But at the same time, I would want them to be sensitive to the way we do things. And so it touches, I think, on what you're saying. That is, that we want to be welcoming and we want to be inclusive, but at the same time, to maintain our communal identity and our values, there has to be a line somewhere.
And when the person, as the Makalel, as this particular person did, when the person does veer astray, it is incumbent upon us to rejigger and reassess, almost like a mini Egla Arufa, to ask ourselves, to what extent are we responsible? To what extent are our priorities perhaps slightly askew? If we lean towards one value, towards one pressure, sometimes we are exposing, or we are relenting, or we're relinquishing another pressure. And earlier on in the Parsha, maybe one of the most morally difficult discussions in the entire Torah, about Baalei Mu'um, Kohanim that are physically deformed, who are, for some reason or another, disqualified.
Yeah.
And so many, like the modern eye reads these verses, and is the Torah being ableist and discriminatory against the disabled? And the modern eye reads that, and our instinct is to look aghast upon these verses. Then we have to try and figure out, what's the value the Torah is trying to preserve here? And I think it's the same thing here when we're talking about the Ben Ish Mitzri and the Isha Yisraelis, and exactly what you were talking about us looking at ourselves as a society and trying to figure out how exactly we hold all of these truths together.
So I went in a very different direction than the two of you.
He was holding it for last.
I was holding it for last. I didn't think this was going to be the direction we would go in. As I said at the outset, it's very unclear from the psukim themselves what kind of triggers this whole episode. And so one of the things that Chazal do is they just look at the story in context and what was just going on, what was just being discussed, and use that as the kind of point of departure. And the Torah had just been discussing the lechem apanim, the showbread. And so Rashi cites the Medrash that says that the Mekalel was triggered by the halacha of that the showbread, the lechem apanim, was baked on Friday. It was placed on the shulchan on Shabbos, and then it remained there until the next Shabbos. And that's 9 days from when it's baked to when ultimately, after that, at that point, the next showbread takes its place, and the 9 days prior baked bread gets consumed by the Kohanim, which are in a sense an expression of the Ribbono Shel Olam being eaten like a korban, but it's eaten by the Kohanim. Okay. And the Mekalel said, how could it be that Hashem, the king, would eat bread that's 9 days old? And he mocked that, and that was his sin. He was triggered by the showbread, which is so interesting. Firstly, there is a sense in which what he's saying is true and almost comes from like a religious zealotry that is this really appropriate for God? Like, how could that be? And so that's interesting. It's interesting that of all the things that are beyond our comprehension, that this would be the thing. There's so much to think about it. If we follow this approach, what is it about the lechem apanim per se? But I saw a beautiful comment from Rav Sorotzkin that resonated very deeply with me. And Rav Sorotzkin says that the sin here ultimately comes from a kind of hubris in thinking that you can understand everything in the Torah. And instead of saying, I don't understand this, and maybe in the passage of time I could understand this, he just says, this makes no sense. And in fact, Rav Sorotzkin says, had he waited for the process to play out, we know that Medrash says that there was a miracle that took place, and that even though it was a week old, or 9 days old, as the case may be, when the lechem hapanim was consumed, it was still as hot, right? 1 week later, it was still, this miracle took place, and it was still as hot and fresh and perfect for consumption. And so had he simply waited, he would have come in the fullness of time, even not that much time, to understand that he misunderstood the whole thing altogether, that it wasn't going to be any sort of diminution of the kavod of Hashem and v'chulei. And for me, the message there, I don't know that this incorporates and accounts for all the details of the story and his mixed background, but I think as a standalone idea, I think it's very powerful. Just the difference between in our religious lives saying, this makes no sense, versus I don't understand this. And sometimes I catch myself, if I'm giving a gemara, I say, this didn't make any sense to me, but versus I didn't understand this. I'm not at a place where I can understand this. And often in life, we can't understand. I find in my own just day-to-day life, sometimes something doesn't make sense to me, and the next morning when I wake up and I look at it afresh, I just have a new insight into it. And kal vachomer, how much more so in the passage of a decade, or right, that things that we don't understand, we have to have the humility to say it doesn't mean that they don't make sense. We have to have a default posture that they do make sense, and I don't get it. And we should also recognize that I may actually get this. It just might take me a couple of years and lived experiences and a new perspective till this actually will click. And I think everyone's had those experiences in life where you're like, well, my Rebbe said this, or my teacher said this, or my parents said this, and 20 years later, I get it. And so all that just, to me, was very resonant.
It's the idea that to learn something and understand something properly, it requires a certain amount of humility that I'm trying to understand it as it's meant to be understood. And so the way you began the idea beautifully about the Ribbono Shel Olam was misunderstood by this person, right? And they were making assumptions about the Ribbono Shel Olam that he thought was to his credit, right? Why should Hashem eat 9-day-old bread? And what he should have done, as you explained, was instead of just assuming it doesn't make sense, is to humble themselves and say, wait a second, so what's going on here? Came in with his set of assumptions. It reminds me also of Avram Yeshua Heschel, likes to talk about the idea of wonder and awe and being able to take a step back and look at cosmos or what have you. But it's also with this. If we approach Hashem with a sense of awe and a sense of wonder, then it'll help us to not make certain assumptions and try to understand and learn things sincerely.
There's so much richness and beauty to what you're saying. And as rabbis, we encounter this all the time. We speak to members of our shul who are entirely well-meaning and so sincere and authentic, who just have questions about a particular thing in their Jewish life. And one of the messages that we always try to get across is, if you reduce Judaism, a system as vast and as grand as halacha, to a snapshot, anything can be made to look ridiculous. This is Korach. Talis shekulo tcheles. Bayis malei sforim. Korach's challenge to Moshe was, you're supposed to have one blue string on a tzitzis. What if the entire beged is blue? Do I still need the blue string? The answer, of course, is yes. But Korach tried to nitpick and reduce it down to a snapshot. And when it's really hard to understand the details of the system without the context of the entire system as a whole. And that's just an important message that all of us not just try to teach, but struggle with ourselves. The more we learn, the more we realize we don't know. Yeah. And just being able to appreciate all of it in the context of everything else, how the system is organic and integrated, is something that we always need to remember.
David HaMelech writes, Uchesil lo yavin et zos. A fool doesn't understand this. Right. If I would walk into the cockpit of a Boeing jet and I would say, what's this switch do? I don't understand. But I don't understand 45 switches. I don't understand anything. So I don't just not understand that. Right. You can only understand that switch. But the foolishness is thinking that, I think I get everything here. I just don't get this one thing. No, you don't. You have to know the whole panel.
That's a beautiful part.
A little bit of history I've been through. Ask me where I'm from, and I will tell you I'm a Jew, and every Jew's a proud Jew. Not just me, my sisters and my brothers. Never be ashamed to be a proud Jew. It's not what you've done, it's how he made you. So sing the song and spread the pride around you. Yehudi ani, eternally.